we have for tonight's speaker, Alicia Hamann, and she is with Friends of the Eel River, and she's going to tell us all the rest. So welcome, Alicia. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, Bill. I am going to take this awkward moment where I set up my screen sharing and power up my presentation. So hopefully you can all see that okay.
Yes, it looks great.
Great. So as Bill said, my name is Alicia Hamann. I'm the ED for Friends of the Eel River. I've been with the organization for a little over 8 years, and I've been director for about 2 years now. So, it's a wonderful organization to work for. And especially right now, there are so many huge things going on for the eel. It's just really an honor to be able to be a part of such great work. So I'm going to start off by giving you just a little bit of background about Friends of the Eel. And I guess, Bill, I should ask you first before I really get into it. If folks have questions throughout the presentation, should I be keeping an eye on the chat feature, or are we just going to do questions all at the end?
Well, I'll keep an eye on the chat. And if there's something that's really burning that fits into where you're going, I will interrupt you. That's okay.
Excellent.
But you don't need to watch it.
Okay, thanks. So Friends of the Eel is a little over 25 years old. We're an environmental nonprofit, and we work for the recovery of the wild and scenic Eel River, its fisheries, and its communities. We were founded in 1994 by a small group of really passionate activists in Southern Humboldt. And those folks way back then had the ultimate goal of removing the dams and the headwaters. We are now at that place where that's a project that we're working on every single day. So it's, like I said, a really exciting time to be a part of this organization, and really a part of any organization that's doing work on the eel. So we use that grassroots space that we have today to do scientific and legal work, to leverage those kinds of tools to really do some powerful advocacy for the river. I guess I should pull up, here's our map of the river for those of you who are not familiar with it. Move these controls. Way down here in the headwaters is the Potter Valley Project. And I should say, to kind of help orient you all, the river flows northward. So when I'm talking about moving upstream, I'm talking about moving south or moving southeast. So the Potter Valley Project, which is what I'm going to be primarily talking about tonight, is way down here in the headwaters. But there's a lot of other forks of the river that have their headwaters elsewhere. And where people are most familiar with the Eel River is the South Fork, because that's adjacent to Highway 101. So if you've ever driven up north and been alongside the Eel, this is the part of the river that you have probably seen. So a little bit of background on the eel and what makes it so special. The eel is the third largest watershed entirely in California, and it's got really diverse landscapes. It's got vast stretches of really rugged wilderness, landscapes that shift from old growth redwood to oak savannas to these massive, massive boulder fields in the upper reaches. And it's about 3,600 square miles. And most of that is private land. About 85 to 90% is on private land. Most of the public land holdings are in the upper watershed in the Mendocino National Forest. And then there's a couple other preserves on the South Fork and farther down on the main stem. And actually the Wildlands Conservancy is in the process of acquiring some pretty large properties on the main stem, which I think have really exciting potential as ecotourist destinations along the stretch of the future Great Redwood Trail, which I will touch on a little bit later in the presentation. One thing that the eel is really well known for is the historic abundance of its fisheries. In the 1850s, this abundance led to the establishment of commercial fisheries, which included canneries in the lower watershed. And using some of that cannery data, we can take a peek into the history to see what the historic salmonid populations were like. So that data tells us that Chinook populations reached up to 800,000 fish annually, and steelhead and coho populations reached at least 100,000. So we're talking about 1 million fish in this river back in the good old days. Today, unfortunately, Chinook and steelhead entering the watershed to spawn number in the low thousands. Coho are doing even worse, and we're expecting that they could be extirpated from the system in the coming decade, which is just really pretty heartbreaking, actually. So because Friends of the Eel is focused on addressing the root causes of this decline, our main programs reflect this. And so one of the biggest projects that we work on right now is dam removal, because that's one of the best things that we can do for fisheries recovery in the eel is to remove those dams, the Potter Valley Project. So let's talk a little bit about the Potter Valley Project. Like I said before, it's located in the headwaters of the Eel River. Some of you might be familiar with Lake Pillsbury Reservoir off of Highway 20. It's basically directly east of Willits, and probably unless you've intended to go there, you probably have never just found yourself out there. It's a little bit difficult to get to. The project consists of 2 dams and a mile-long diversion tunnel through a mountain, which diverts water from the Eel River to the Russian River and then into a powerhouse. So this little red line right here, that's that diversion tunnel. And I already talked about how the eel flows northward, so I don't need to do that orienting part of the presentation. So as you travel upstream, like the fish do, the first dam that you'll come to is Cape Horn Dam. It was completed in 1908. It stands about 96 feet tall. It's got a reservoir with about a 700 acre-foot capacity, but most of that is silted up at this point. That's called Van Arsdale Reservoir. Cape Horn Dam does have a fish ladder, but it's really moderately effective. And in fact, it often closes at peak migration flows because of the really high velocity of water coming down and it getting all clogged up with debris. I'll talk more about why that's really problematic later. At Cape Horn Dam is that diversion tunnel that I talked about before. It's quite a feat of engineering. Like I said, it travels through a mountain, it's a mile long, transfers water out of the Eel into the Russian. It sends about 65,000 acre feet a year into the East Branch of the Russian. And the diversion tunnel ends at the powerhouse. And so that's where electricity is generated. It's a very small amount of electricity that's generated. And after water is used to generate electricity, then it's used by the community of Potter Valley, primarily for irrigation, and then any remaining water travels down the rest of the Russian River into Lake Mendocino. What's most problematic about this diversion is the timing of it. So when you hear folks talk about trying to fix the diversion or address it, at least from the Eel River standpoint, it's not about the cumulative amount of the diversion. It's about the fact that it comes throughout the entire year. And during the dry season, it's just really ecologically harmful to the river. Potter Valley doesn't have storage for the water that they use, so they receive it when they need it most. But that's unfortunately during the spring and summer when the eel can least afford to spare those flows. During the dry season, the project is often sending large amounts of water through the diversion tunnel and very little trickling down the Eel. Although I do have to say the Eel is a very flashy system. And by that, I mean that there are times when there is naturally very little water in the Eel during the summertime, and then torrential amounts of water during the wintertime. So it's especially as we see our climate changing and we see less snowpack and less predictable precipitation, it's really important that we kind of revert to allowing natural systems to do what they do best, in my humble opinion. What else can I say about the powerhouse? It's a money loser. Not only is the amount of electricity generated really insignificant, it also costs roughly $30 for every dollar of electricity generated. The infrastructure is extremely old. The tunnel that diverts the water often is closed for maintenance. Last year, they had to shut off the entire diversion to repair the penstock. And right now, the powerhouse is actually completely out of commission because we learned just recently that there's a failure of the main transformer bank, which just really is yet another thing that underscores how old this system is and how unreliable it is. When it is operating, the powerhouse generates about 5 megawatts, which is roughly enough to power a Walmart. And a study from 2015 indicated that it could be replaced by about 3 acres of solar panels. So, continuing the journey of the fish, if they manage to get past Cape Horn Dam, they arrive at Scott Dam. Scott Dam was built in 1922. It's about 140 feet tall, and it impounds Lake Pillsbury Reservoir, which has a roughly 75,000 acre foot capacity, although, silt and sediment continue to build up in that reservoir. And because of some concerns about sediment banks collapsing and causing damage to the water releases, water managers actually make sure to keep about 10,000 acre feet in the reservoir at all times. 75,000 acre feet, but actually there's less of that that's available. One of the biggest problems with Scott Dam is that it doesn't have a fish ladder. It also leads to the accumulation of methylated mercury. It was built on a fault line and presents some really serious seismic concerns. And I will spend a bunch of time talking about Scott Dam soon. And then the whole project, like I said, is owned by PG&E since 1930, but they have indicated that they are no longer interested in owning the project. Just today, we got PG&E's gross generation report. So this shows all the electricity that's generated from all their hydropower projects. And I just wanted to throw this up here to show you guys how comparatively little electricity is generated at Potter Valley. This is Potter Valley project up here with their roughly 5 megawatts. You can see from some of their other projects that it is, an order of magnitude less than the other electricity generated, and would put very little damper in PG&E's electricity generation to lose that. So why remove the dams? There's lots of reasons, like I said before, and I'll start with what's most important to Friends of the Eel River, which is fish passage. As I mentioned, the fish ladder at Cape Horn Dam is really inadequate. It needs a lot of extensive upgrades, and Friends of the Eel asserts that it actually causes take of listed species. So we would prefer to see the entire Cape Horn Dam removed along with Scott Dam. Take, by the way, is a legal term. It means to harm, harass, capture, or kill listed species. The definition's a little longer, but that basically captures it. Under the current license that PG&E has to operate this project, they have what's called an incidental take permit. And so that basically allows them to harm or kill listed species under a normal operation of the project. However, this expires in April when their license expires. And Friends of the Eel has, of course, been preparing to litigate in the event that swift action is not taken to remove the fish passage barriers. This is a photo of the fish ladder infrastructure when it's clogged with debris during high flows. When this happens, water to the fish ladder is shut off and the fish ladder is taken completely offline while PG&E spends days or even weeks cleaning it out. And it's really problematic because these peak flows are exactly when the fish are trying to make a lot of progress on their migration journey up to their spawning grounds. So if migrating fish, which includes iconic species like the Pacific lamprey, in addition to summer and winter steelhead and Chinook salmon. If all those folks manage to make it past Cape Horn Dam, they're then abruptly stopped at Scott Dam and prevented from reaching an additional 280 miles of prime spawning habitat. One thing that is really exciting that we've just started to learn more about in the last few years is summer steelhead. And I really hope there are not too many fisheries biologists in the audience here today, because I'm going to put this embarrassingly simply. But basically, the genetic coding for summer steelhead lives on in resident trout that are trapped behind Scott Dam. So trout are essentially freshwater versions of steelhead. And again, I apologize for vastly oversimplifying this. But the fact that the allele that codes for premature migration or summer run timing, the fact that that still exists in these trout behind Scott Dam presents a really, really exciting potential for reviving Northern California summer steelhead. The species was just listed as endangered under the California Endangered Species Act, thanks to a petition by Friends of the Eel River. And preserving their unique life history is a really, really critical part of protecting biodiversity and giving salmonids the resilience that they need to adapt to things like climate change. So removing Scott Dam is just a huge, huge opportunity for these native fish, which, by the way, are pictured in this lovely turquoise river picture back here. So there are actually lots of reasons, in addition to fish passage problems, why it is inevitable that Scott Dam will be removed. These include concerns about safety and reliability, the cost of regular operations and upgrades, and other ecosystem impacts. So for years, Friends of the Eel has been drawing attention to issues with safety and reliability at Scott Dam in particular, and the whole project in general. Several years ago, we commissioned a study by an engineering firm called Miller Pacific, who concluded that there were significant geologic hazards to Scott Dam, including an active landslide just behind the south side of the dam. Scott Dam also sits within a concerning proximity to the Bartlett Springs fault line, which is pictured right here, running right through the middle of the reservoir. This is where Scott Dam sits. This fault line is capable of producing pretty significant earthquakes up to a magnitude 7. And as a side note, it's actually not unusual for dams to be located directly on or adjacent to faults, because it's the point at which river channels are naturally the most narrow. So back in the 20th century, these narrow spots seemed like really logical, ideal locations to situate dams. Another dam safety concern is the unstable foundation. Just behind the right or southern side of the dam, right here, is a huge and slowly shifting boulder that the original construction team unnervingly called the knocker. You'll notice in photos of Scott Dam, or if you ever get the chance to visit, that instead of going all the way straight across the river, there's this really sharp angle right here. And that's there because during construction, the engineers began anchoring the dam to what they thought was bedrock. And then it slipped, there was some movement, and they discovered that actually it was just a huge boulder. So this is, this is a pretty concerning thing. And if I lived downstream from the dam, I would probably be kept awake at night thinking about the knocker. I should mention also that Scott Dam is rated as a high hazard facility, which means that loss of life is likely in the event of dam failure. The safety issues at Scott Dam also make it a really unreliable structure and water supply source. And there are additional factors that make the project unreliable. One of those is the sediment that's accumulating behind the dam and in the channels in the reservoir. I mentioned sediment being a concern before, and PG&E needing to keep a certain level of water in the reservoir to prevent the sediment banks from collapsing. The eel has the highest suspended sediment load of any river in the continental US. And so it really, contributes a lot of sediment that gets, stopped up in the reservoir. At the dam, there are two ways that water can be released. One is over the top when the reservoir is completely full, and the other is through a needle valve, which is the only low-level outlet. It's right near the base of the dam. This valve is really vulnerable to becoming clogged with sediment, which would render it completely useless. Any flows would cease immediately. And while it is possible for PG&E to repair this, we know that because in 2007, I believe, they actually removed it and did some repairs. They have acknowledged, though, that there is no plan in place to repair the valve in the event of a failure. So we would see a lot of scrambling, and it would just, it just makes the structure extremely unreliable. And as I mentioned before, too, that the main transformer bank at the powerhouse is also down right now, which is just yet another factor contributing to the unreliability of this project. And that transformer bank failure means not only that there's no electricity being generated right now, but it results in a pretty severe limit to how much water can be diverted, because they have to use a bypass channel rather than going through the powerhouse as they normally would. So it actually means a lot less water for folks in Potter Valley and for the Sonoma County Water Agency. Another reason why Scott Dam removal is inevitable is that it is really expensive. I mentioned before that running the project is super expensive. It costs $30 to generate every dollar of electricity. And it's important to remember that it's not PG&E that's paying for that, it's the ratepayers. But the project always also needs some really expensive upgrades to come into compliance with modern environmental laws. And then the project helps invasive species. The Sacramento pike minnow are invasive to the Eel River. They thrive in the warm, stagnant conditions in the Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. Conditions which salmonids do not thrive in. Pike minnow were first introduced to the reservoir in the 70s as bait fish, and they've since proliferated throughout the entire watershed. So it's a really common conversation among Eel River advocates, like what do we do about the pike minnow? How do we possibly get rid of them? They're really problematic because they not only compete with native fish for habitat and resources, but they also predate on salmonids. So you often will find pike minnow, and in their bellies are juvenile steelhead, and it is a big problem. Because they thrive in the ecosystem that's created by the dams, wildlife experts have acknowledged that dam removal is one of the best things that we can do to address this growing population of pike minnow. Also, restoring access to the headwaters will provide species like steelhead with access to refugia that pike minnow can't access. This is a picture here. Maybe 5 or 6 years ago, I was out with some researchers who were evaluating this set of roughs to see whether it was a barrier to anadromy. So they're trying to see if steelhead could make this climb here. Turns out that they can, because steelhead are incredible athletes. They can jump. Basically every time there's a question of, oh, here's a waterfall or here's a barrier, can steelhead get above this? Eventually we find evidence of steelhead up above it. Like they can climb some amazing high heights, but pike minnow can't. Pike minnow do not have the same kind of strength that steelhead do. And so there are places up above Scott Dam where steelhead could get to and rear their juveniles in peace and not have to deal with pike minnow around every corner. And then finally, the dams harm native species. I mentioned fish passage before, which is really one of the biggest concerns, but another impact to native fish is the natural accumulation of methylated mercury. And here I have to apologize to any chemists who might be in the audience, because I'm going to once again really oversimplify something. But mercury basically naturally methylates in the anaerobic environment, like a reservoir, and then it becomes biologically available, and it bioaccumulates as, you know, things eat each other and it moves up the food chain. And then it actually presents real dangers to predators and to any human who might consume fish caught in the reservoir. In 2014, a study of fish throughout the entire state revealed the fish with the highest recorded mercury level was from Lake Pillsbury. So if y'all are going out and fishing and eating your catch, I do not recommend doing that at Lake Pillsbury. So let's talk a little bit about the regulatory side of the issue. Hydropower projects are regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC. So if you hear me say FERC, I am not using a nasty four-letter word, although it sometimes feels like it's a nasty four-letter word. These licenses are issued about every 50 years. And so that means for many projects like the Potter Valley project, it's kind of a once in a lifetime opportunity when relicensing comes about, because oftentimes modern environmental laws didn't exist during the last relicensing. So it's, you know, really just this great opportunity to improve or remove these projects. The license for the Potter Valley project expires in 2022. It's about a 5-year process to renew a license. So in 2017, PG&E began that process, but they later decided to abandon the effort. They took us on this crazy, twisting, winding path of trying to sell and auction the project. And, you know, there were several very unprecedented things that happened. They ultimately declared bankruptcy because of their wildfire liabilities. And then at that point, PG&E might have applied to surrender their license, but instead a group of diverse stakeholders, who are now known as the Two Basin Partnership, submitted a notice of intent to take over the project. So the relicensing effort of the Two Basin Partnership proceeded for a couple of years, but it now appears very likely that it's going to be unsuccessful. This is largely because of a lack of funding. It also, I would argue that some entities in the partnership were never really committed to achieving a two-basin solution, and so negotiations have been really slow and kind of painful. But anyway, in the next month, we'll know more about their timeline, but it is fairly certain that dam removal will now happen along the license surrender process, rather than through relicensing. So I'll talk a little bit about the two-basin solution. When PG&E began their process in 2017, Congressman Huffman convened an ad hoc stakeholder group that began the work to evaluate the potential for a two-basin solution, as he branded it. And this would meet both fish passage needs and water supply needs. Within the ad hoc, there were 2 technical working groups focused on these same 2 topics. And the basis for the two-basin solution is 2 co-equal goals, as we call them. You can read them here on your own. Essentially, the goals just mean achieving volitional fish passage while avoiding adverse impacts to the water supply. And a side note about volitional fish passage, the definition is kind of, I think, different to many different people. One National Marine Fisheries Service employee referred to it as allowing the fish to go where they want, when they want, with no human assistance. And that's the definition I like to use. It's simple, it's very clear. And one thing that I have learned in this process is that when working with a broad diversity of stakeholders, it's really important that we're all using the same definition for terms like this. So on the note of fish passage, and specifically volitional fish passage, it's always been clear to groups like Friends of the Eel that the best option for volitional fish passage is dam removal. But that also eventually became clear following years of really thorough studies. The Ad Hoc's Fish Passage Working Group studied possible alternative scenarios. They studied a variety of ladders. They studied trap and haul, which technically isn't volitional. They studied side channels built around the dams. They even not so seriously looked into a fish cannon from a company called Whoosh, which also is not volitional passage. Ultimately, because of a variety of factors, any fish ladder at Scott Dam would really only be marginally effective and would cost at least $90 million. And even more problematic is downstream migration. I'm actually not sure if the technical team ever did find a viable option for downstream migration. And so without that, volitional fish passage, which is the fish going where they want, when they want, is not actually achieved. These two websites at the bottom here, pottervalleyproject.org and twobasinSolution.org. The first one is the website for Congressman Hoffman's ad hoc working group, and the second is for the Two Basin Solution Partnership. Both have some great resources. You can find the studies that I referenced and a variety of other really useful materials. And I should probably touch briefly on the key players here. So this is a nearly complete list of all the stakeholders participating in the ad hoc committee. I may have left some off, but I tried to focus on those who have been most active. But this really, I just want to emphasize that there are a lot of diverse folks coming together to try to make this thing work. And then highlighted in yellow are the 5 entities that are part of the planning agreement or the Two Basin Partnership. And I should say, it's actually not Potter Valley Irrigation District, but the Mendocino County Inland Water and Power Commission. However, they represent Potter Valley, and they're, really the stakeholders who are most concerned about securing their water interests. The way that the partnership, the entities, these 5 entities came together is kind of interesting, and it's something that's commonly misunderstood. So I want to take a minute to tell that little history. Originally, it was the 2 water supply groups who planned to submit a notice of intent to relicense the project on their own. And then luckily Cal Trout was able to join them as an advocate for Eel River fisheries. And then shortly after that, Humboldt County and Round Valley Indian tribes. At this point, there was some contention about others trying to join and kind of shift that balance of water versus fisheries interests. Most notably, Lake County was really interested in joining, and they were even willing to commit $100,000 to help fund the feasibility study. But Friends of the Eel and other fisheries advocates were really concerned about Lake County's objectives in joining the group. They had been extremely clear that they do not support dam removal, that they did not agree to the basic tenets of the Two Basin Solution, and that they were advocating primarily for keeping the Lake Pillsbury Reservoir. Because the partnership required that all entities agree to those 2 co-equal goals, we felt like it really just didn't make sense for Lake County to be able to join this partnership. So what Friends of the Eel did, joining the partnership required a unanimous vote of all the existing members. And so the tactic that Friends of the Eel employed was to submit our own request to join the group, knowing full well that there were members of that group who did not want a, rebel rousers like Friends of the Eel in there. And so ultimately that was successful, and no new members were admitted to the group, and they closed the group to any new membership. And just to be clear, this is not to say that Lake County was prevented from participating as a stakeholder. They have been a part of the ad hoc committee meetings, just like the rest of us, and have definitely never been excluded from that process. It's definitely what we're talking about here is going to mean some pretty big changes for a few people in Lake County. And so it's really important that they're a part of that process and that we find ways, to make sure that the changes are, that there's some benefit to that region as well. So I'll just touch really briefly on water supply. The water supply side of the equation is not my expertise, but I do want to make sure that I cover it a little bit. The out-of-basin diversion from the Eel to the Russian has been in place since Cape Horn was built, which was, again, back in 1908. Before then, Potter Valley was a dry farming community. And this is Potter Valley about right here at the end of the diversion tunnel. But now they enjoy relatively abundant water. Anyone who has been to Potter Valley remarks on how green it is there compared to the surrounding area. And this is because the water that they receive from the PG&E powerhouse, they receive it at a really low cost because it's considered essentially a waste byproduct from PG&E's electrical generation. So that community has had the opportunity to develop this really unique economy and kind of grow up around this abundant source. And this is a big part of why it's politically untenable for even a really fierce fisheries advocate like Congressman Huffman to support dam removal without pursuing a continued diversion as well. What else can I say about this? Some of the latest technical memos about water use reveal some really interesting details about water use efficiency in Potter Valley. The documents are not yet available to the public, so I can't really go into detail, but I think it's sufficient to say that there are ways in which Potter Valley could really improve their water use and efficiency. They basically lose the same amount of water to seepage in their unlined canals and evaporation as they use on row crops and permanent crops like grapes and pears. And so there's a lot of water that could be saved with some upgrades to their canal system. And as I said before, any water left over after the community of Potter Valley uses it continues down the east branch of the Russian and eventually makes it into Lake Mendocino, where Sonoma County Water Agency then uses that water to provide for fish flows and a variety of other needs. So I touched on before this process and mentioned that it appears that the partners will be unsuccessful in their relicensing efforts. Just last month, the partners had a requirement to submit a status report to FERC detailing their progress on completing studies and other components of the relicensing process. Unfortunately, they've actually made very little progress. And like I said, this is largely due to the fact that PG&E has refused to negotiate with them or to cover the costs of relicensing studies like we all hoped they would. So in lieu of a progress report, the partners submitted a request for an abeyance or a pause in their process until May of next year. Well, May is after the new license application would actually be due. And so FERC responded in what we thought was a surprisingly reasonable way by denying the abeyance and imposing a deadline to submit a progress report within 60 days. So in about a month, the partners need to submit a report with FERC detailing, how little progress they've made. Absent some miraculous source of tens of millions of dollars in funding and a sudden embrace in rapid negotiations, unlike anything we've seen, we anticipate that the partners will be withdrawing their notice of intent to relicense. They should do this in November, but they may wait until early next year. They could even wait as long as April when the license application is due, but this would frankly be pretty irresponsible, and it would just be enabling PG&E to continue acting as a bad actor. PG&E has made it clear that they are willing and interested to apply to surrender their license. So as soon as the partners withdraw their notice of intent to relicense, then PG&E can be ordered by FERC to begin the surrender process. And we can all begin moving down this new path to dam removal. It's important to keep in mind that license surrender does not directly translate to project decommissioning and removal. So there is some amount of uncertainty still. But for all the reasons that I spoke to before, FERC would be actually in a really legally vulnerable position in a number of ways if they do not order project removal. And you can bet that Friends of the Eel has already indicated to FERC that we are willing and ready to pursue litigation if they don't do what's right and go ahead and mandate dam removal. Bill, I guess I should maybe check in on time before I jump into talking about summer steelhead and a little bit about the Great Redwood Trail.
Yeah, you're doing fine. We have
Okay.
time for that.
Great. So I spoke a little bit about summer steelhead earlier. They are really, really cool fish. And for those of you who aren't in the know, basically what summer steelhead and also spring chinook, what fish who we call premature migrators do is they come into the river much earlier than their fall and winter counterparts. And they come in sexually immature and they're really beefy and strong and vibrant. And they move up the water or up the watershed. And then they find these deep holes to, really deep cold pools where they hold in throughout the summer. And then when the rains come in the fall and winter, they're already really far up into the watershed. So they're able to go way up into the headwaters, up into these upper reaches that a lot of times winter steelhead aren't making their way up to. In the eel, the summer steelhead, they're the southernmost reach of summer run steelhead. In fact, the research says that they're the southernmost in North America, but there actually aren't, as far as I know, steelhead anywhere farther south on the planet. So they're, super special, and we're really lucky to still have them in the Eel River. So as this map shows, they've been found in the upper reaches of the Van Dusen and the Middle Fork. And this is a little out of date because they also have been found in the upper reaches of the North Fork. And if it were not for Scott Dam, you would also see them indicated here on the upper reaches of the main stem. Some really interesting research that we're just starting to see is that, like I said before, the rainbow trout above Scott Dam not only have the gene for anadromy, which is the trait that allows them to migrate from freshwater to saltwater and back again, but they also have this gene for premature migration, or the summer run timing. In our efforts to learn more about and protect the summer steelhead, we've been working with some really excellent scientists out of UC Davis from Mike Miller's lab. One of those is Samantha Canry, and she actually lived on the Van Dusen and spurred a lot of the research into summer steelhead on the eel because she heard stories from locals about these really amazing fish. So she really deserves a lot of credit for her amazing work and her dedication to these fish. You guys should see the places that she hikes to with very few resources just to document these fish that nobody knew were there. So kudos to her. And I'm going to share some of her maps. This first map shows data on fish found to have the gene for anadromy. So these the blue shows fish that are strictly resident trout, but then the black and yellow indicate fish that have some level of anadromy. Maybe they're, heterozygotes, so they've got like one allele for anadromy, or they might be might have the full genetic coding for it. But remember, these are all fish that are trapped up behind Scott Dam, so they're not actually living out that life cycle. The second map here shows, it shows fish that have the gene for premature migration. There's a lot of interesting things you can conclude by comparing these two maps, and I'm not going to try to oversimplify Sam's research. But basically what you can see up here, this triangle here is Bloody Rock Rough. That's the photo that I showed before where we were measuring the potential barrier to anadromy. And what's really interesting about this map is that it shows that the genetic coding for that summer run timing is continuing to exist in these trout way up here. You know what, there's a lot of theories about that, and I believe what it essentially boils down to is that this is a region that's much easier for summer steelhead to access because, like I said before, they you know, they kind of have a head start on the other migrating fish. So back 100 years ago, before Scott Dam was in place, it's likely that summer run steelhead were making their way all the way up here. And then because they were already really high up here, once the winter rains came, they were able to take advantage of those high flows at a rough like this and just shoot up above it. So the reason that I share this all with you in relation to talking about dam removal is because you know, what this research means is that once we remove the dams and restore fish passage, there's potential for the progeny of these trout to start their anadromous life history again and to essentially become steelhead or even summer steelhead. It's really important to preserve diverse life history, to give species the full, you know, a full range of potential life histories to be resilient in the face of something like climate change. So anything we can do to help summer steelhead survive is really going to be beneficial for salmonids at large. And speaking of what we've done to help them, back in 2018, Friends of the Eel submitted petitions to list summer steelhead at both the state and the federal level. Last year, the feds denied our petition, which was not exactly surprising. We kind of anticipated that. But this summer, our petition before the state was approved. So Northern California summer steelhead are now listed as endangered at the state of California. And right now we're continuing to work with the scientists at UC Davis to develop additional research, look at historic samples, and we're going to continue seeking a listing with the feds, either by litigating the denial or just resubmitting a whole new petition. And I should say too that our attempts to list summer steelhead are really nicely aligned with the attempts to list spring Chinook, which are spearheaded by the Karuk tribe on the Klamath. And then spring Chinook also exists in watersheds farther north. Thanks to the really compelling evidence that we have, as well as the state listing, I feel really hopeful about securing a federal listing and getting that additional recognition for these critically endangered fish. And speaking of really critical things, I'll just talk briefly about the Great Redwood Trail. So the North Coast Railroad Authority is a state agency which currently manages this line, which has been closed since 1996, like 25 years now. The line runs through the main, like along the main stem of the Eel River through what we call the Eel River Canyon, or what some people call the Grand Canyon of the Eel River. It's a really spectacular, beautiful region, very wild and rugged and extremely difficult to access. So the North Coast Railroad Authority became the owners of the line in the late 80s, and they were attempting to rebuild the line for quite a while, but lacked funding. And importantly, they were also trying to circumvent CEQA. They claimed that they had federal preemption because of the unique laws that are designed to protect railroads from just about any kind of oversight. So Friends of the Eel challenged this, and eventually, after almost a decade of litigation, we ended up at the California Supreme Court, where in 2017, the court ruled in our favor and ruled that CEQA does in fact have to apply to the North Coast Railroad Authority in their work in trying to rebuild this line. So that victory paved the way for Senator McGuire's legislation to establish the Great Redwood Trail. So the vision is a 320-mile trail, which would connect Humboldt Bay to San Francisco Bay. It would be the longest continuously branded rail trail in the entire nation. And like I said, it would just go through some really, really spectacular, beautiful places. There are already portions of the trail in place. In Ukiah, there's several areas where it's a rail with trail project. And so there's kind of more urban version of the trail. All the way up here in Humboldt, around Humboldt Bay, there's a portion of the Humboldt Bay Trail, which sits adjacent to the existing tracks. So that's like piece by piece kind of coming together. But it's, just a really, really exciting project. However, there is a serious wrinkle which has presented itself. And so fast forward through all the litigation with North Coast Railroad Authority and the great work that Senator McGuire's done, the NCRA has now transitioned to a trail building ally, which is kind of weird for us. But so they're, we talk with them pretty frequently about trying to bring this great vision into reality. And one of the first steps that they had to take was to rail bank the line. And that's a legal process with the Surface Transportation Board, which essentially preserves the right of way for alternative transportation uses, like, for example, a trail. Unfortunately, in the process of rail banking, there is an opportunity opened up for other freight operators who might want to come in and purchase the line, possibly privatize it, and then basically do whatever they want with it because of the way that federal railroad laws are designed. So we have seen that there are interested parties who are seeking to submit what's called an offer of financial assistance in this rail banking process. This is something that none of us expected for a variety of reasons, mostly because the expense of rebuilding and maintaining the line is so extreme. The conservative estimate to rebuild the line is that it would be $2.3 billion. It's probably more like double that. And then there's just the ongoing maintenance. The eel, like I mentioned before, has really high suspended sediment. And that's partially because it's such a geologically fragile region. So it's really just an inappropriate place for infrastructure like a train. In fact, the inaugural run of the line was delayed. There was a whole big ceremony that didn't happen until midnight because it took so long for the very first run of the train to finish. And that's how it went for most of its history. It at times was the most expensive line in the nation to maintain. So it's just really an unsuitable location for rail. Nothing against rail in general. So like I said, we have seen some indications that there are entities interested in submitting offers of financial assistance. One of them in particular is this very secretive, shady LLC based out of Wyoming called the North Coast Railroad Company. A little bit of digging revealed that this LLC is connected to coal interests in the Great Plains. So we, once we realized that, we started to take the threat very seriously. And that's because, like I said, there's a really high expense associated with reviving this line. And really the only commodity that could make it financially feasible is very high volume, high value freight shipment like coal. So any plan to rebuild this line could involve, shipping other freight, but it would definitely have to involve coal to pay for itself. And unfortunately, it could never be suitable for passenger rail again because of the high safety standards that we have these days, and just the geologic instability of the region, the grade of the line. There's a number of factors that a railroad engineer could walk you through, which I am not. And then there's, it kind of goes on and on. I could talk a lot about the coal train. Really, the way that federal railroad law is designed makes it extremely difficult for us to fight this. So we have built a coalition with several other organizations, nocoalhumboldt.org. This is not just about Humboldt, though, because the plan, like I said, is to bring coal from the Great Plains across the center of California. They would file what's called a feeder line application to run freight on the SMART lines through all of those lovely cities, through Petaluma, all the way up north, eventually out to Humboldt Bay, where they would then have to build a port facility, get the bay dredged more often, do a lot of really expensive things there. So there's a number of reasons why it's a really, really absurd proposal, but it's something that we need to take seriously because coal would poison the entire region. And I think we all know the many other reasons why coal is just a horrible, horrible idea. So I will leave it at that. This is my contact information, the cute picture of me running the main stem eel, which I would say is a spectacular run. If any of you are rafters or kayakers, I would love to give you tips on where to put in, how to figure out the crazy car shuttle in such a remote region. There's unfortunately no commercial outfitters on the eel, so it's a very self-service river, but very, very much worth it.
Okay, thank you very much, Alicia.
Yeah.
So there's a few questions and a few comments. But I just want to make one comment before we get back to the Potter Valley project. The idea of this coal train getting up to Humboldt and them building a coal port or a coal facility in Humboldt Bay just seems really crazy.
Yeah, it's nuts. It's yeah, I mean, I try to envision what it would mean for our region and for an area that places such high value on our air quality and our water quality, to then have coal trains running through Old Town Eureka into Humboldt Bay is just is a horrifying prospect. And, I hope this is one of those situations where in a couple of years, everyone just accuses us of being a bunch of Chicken Littles and freaking out about something that didn't happen. That's, I think, best case scenario. But like I said, at this point, we do have to take it pretty seriously because there's, local and regional municipalities do not actually have the jurisdiction to regulate what kinds of materials are carried on freight trains. And the coal interests behind this are quite desperate. They've been turned away at 6 or 7 other ports along the West Coast, from all the way from Bellingham down to, I think the farthest south one, maybe, I can't remember where the farthest south one was. One of the most recent ones that you all might be familiar with is in Richmond. There's been a pretty big opposition to new coal proposals, but yeah, it's, there's a lot of desperation. I think they see the writing on the wall that coal is being phased out in a real way, and they're trying to cash in.
I used to live very close to the Port of Los Angeles and saw the coal port there. It's pretty amazing. I won't give you any details on that. So we've got a number of different comments and questions. There's a number of comments about the pike minnow. So initially, the first question was, if the dam is removed, and because Alicia mentioned pike thrive in warmer stagnant water behind the dam, is it assumed that the pike will not survive in the colder moving water? And then there was a further question further on, or a comment saying that in the summer, the river won't be cold and moving, it'll be warm and stagnant, which is perfect for the pike minnow. So what happens with the pike minnow if the dam is gone?
Yeah, so just because they thrive in warmer waters doesn't mean that they wouldn't survive in colder waters, because we see them survive in the eel during the winter time, and that second comment is right on about the eel. Like I mentioned before, it's the term we like to use is flashy. I don't know if that's like a scientific term or just what we have come up with around my office, but it's a river system that has huge variability in its flows. And so with or without the dams, we're going to see really, really low flows in the summertime and really, really high flows in the wintertime. I think what removing the dams will do is remove a huge habitat that is really conducive to encouraging pike minnows to breed and then move throughout the system. It won't be a cure-all. We will still have pike minnow in the eel, and we'll still have to come up with other ways to remove them or to encourage salmonids in other ways.
So I have a question about the environmental impact of removing the dam. Obviously, you mentioned the silting, and there's quite a bit of, clearly after so many years, nobody really knows what it looks like under the water, but clearly there'll be a lot of silt. And a lot of that silt will be full of methylated mercury. So what happens if the dam is removed? What is it going to look like? How long is it going to take to clean out?
Yeah, well, this was a really big concern of ours. And we actually got a lot of relief from a study that was funded by I think it was the California Coastal Conservancy that actually funded the mercury studies. And what they found was that the mercury does not actually, again, I apologize for really oversimplifying this. If there's any chemists out there that want to pipe up, I would welcome it. But what their study found was that the mercury is not a part of the sediment in the way that we had feared. And it lives in the organic matter, not in the inorganic matter. So what, originally the two basin partners and some of the teams in the ad hoc committee were working on studies to see if there was some kind of, sediment removal that was needed, if we were going to have to be scooping out all the sediment before dam removal happened, and how there was a lot of questions about how do we deal with the sediment. And my understanding of where it's landed is that actually an approach similar to the Elwha dams is going to be appropriate for this dam. And what happened at the Elwha, there was no sediment removal. The dams were removed and the sediment flowed downstream. They tried to time it in a way that sediment flow was least harmful to the aquatic species. And then what it ended up doing is contributing to a really productive estuary habitat. It grew out the beach and was actually a really, turned out to be a benefit to the watershed. So I would hope that we would see a similar outcome in the eel, but that's actually part of some of the studies that still need to be done, is understanding exactly what the best process is for dam removal and what is going to happen. Modeling flows and sediment and things like that.
And so there are a number of comments talking about basically the other side of the argument. So the value of Lake Pillsbury, what happens to the people there, the value of the water there, the value of the water storage, the value of the lake environment. Firefighting was mentioned in a couple of comments, that without the lake, there won't be water available to fight fires. So
yeah,
I'm not sure if you want to say anything about those, but clearly there's trade-offs.
There
a long
are
time. There's a whole environment that's come living around that lake now.
Yeah, and I would say, as far as the argument about wanting to protect the ecosystem that has formed around the reservoir over the last 100 years, that reservoir actually destroyed an ecosystem to itself exist. So, it's really kind of a question of like, well, if we're looking at, I guess, the same principle that we use to evaluate water rights in this state, first in time, first in line kind of thing, well, shouldn't the original ecosystem really bear, get the precedent over the new reservoir ecosystem? Like that's kind of, I think, an argument that I don't give a lot of merit to. But some of the other concerns are extremely valid, and exactly why the two basin solution approach is being pursued. Like I said, in Potter Valley, there's this really unique agricultural ecosystem that's built up around this water supply. And so to cut that off is really kind of unconscionable. And I think it's really important that those who are relying on that water system recognize that this right now is their opportunity to secure a future diversion. FERC is not in the business of water supply. They're in the business of generating electricity. So if all of this is left up to FERC, they will likely, because of the ways in which they're legally vulnerable, they will likely mandate to PG&E to remove the project. And, they might not go any farther than that. So that's why it's really important that folks who want to protect that water diversion speak up now and really come to the table with whatever resources they can, and recognize that they're probably going to have to face some changes and come up with a way to monetize the water in an appropriate way and pay for new infrastructure, and probably find some creative solutions to storing water in underground aquifers, improving the efficiency of their use, and a variety of other things. And then I would say too, to the comments about fire suppression, that's a huge concern in the entire state, in the entire Western region. And I would point out that we have actually seen fires around Lake Pillsbury, devastating fires. The August complex is one that comes to mind. And, unfortunately, the reservoir being there did very little to stop those fires. So we've seen that, water carriers can dip into river systems. And so I would hope that would be a resource that continues to be available in the future. There are other lakes and reservoirs in the region, but thus far it has not prevented devastating wildfires. So I would hate that would be the main thing that we would be hoping on in the future to prevent such wildfires.
Okay. And there are a couple other comments about the trail on the tracks. And talking about tunnels. So there's collapsed tunnels, and the comments that it would be easier to clear the tunnels for hikers in a trail than it would be to clear the tunnels for a train system. So that makes sense.
Yeah, that's for sure. It will, the idea of trying to make that line suitable again, or make the right of way suitable again for rail is almost laughable. Okay,
clearly differences of opinion in the comments, but certainly it's a sensitive topic when anytime a dam gets removed or is talked about. Thank you very much, Alicia, for giving us the Friends of the River position.
Thanks, Bill.
We hopefully will see everybody back in January. Thank you, Alicia. Good night.